Welcome back to the MOOC course titled Qualitative Research Methods. My name is Aradhana Malik and I'm helping you with this course. And we have been talking about various things. We started with a discussion on interviews and how interviewing takes place. So we will move on with that discussion and we'll wind up the discussion on interviews in this lecture. Okay. So in the last lecture we talked about structured interviews that are pre-decided. In this lecture we will cover two more types of interviews, that is the unstructured interviews and the group interviews. Okay, the unstructured interview. The unstructured interview is also known as an open-ended interview. It's also known as an interview without predetermined categories or responses. We don't know what we can expect. The characteristics of this interview are participant observation. The interviewer goes into the situation and observes the situation as a participant of the situation. The interviewer participates to the extent that the information can be garnered from the situation. Then the other characteristic is that the responses are highly influenced by the personal attitudes of both the interviewer and the interviewed. The characteristics of the interviewed will affect how the interviewer responds, and the characteristics of the interviewer will affect how the interviewed also responds to the interviewer. Then it is quite flexible in nature because it's unstructured. The informants may or may not be identifiable, again because we are not going in with a set pattern. People may or may not be identifiable. There's more involvement on the part of the interviewer and the interviewee because a rapport needs to be established. A conversation as close to a real conversation takes place. Now in the unstructured interview, what happens is we go and ask questions. We say okay, in the structured interview we go and ask questions and we say okay, this is like this is like what is your response, this is the question, can you please choose between these available responses. So even if the rapport is not established, it's okay, but then some amount of rapport has to be established, but then there is no real conversation there. But here a real conversation takes place, and that real conversation then facilitates the giving of responses, or the responses sort of coming out, and they are built into the conversation, and the skill of the interviewer lies in picking out the required information from a conversation that takes place between the interviewer and the interviewed or the interviewee. Okay. The concerns of the interviewer are accessing the site and adaptability to the site, because the interviewer has to or is required to become a participant in that observation, in the process, in the situation that one is going to be conducting the interview in. The adaptability to that site, to the physical location, to the physical context becomes very, very important. It's also important to understand the culture of the respondents, because we need to be on the same page, so to say, with the respondents who we are interviewing. Deciding how to present oneself so the comfort zones of the interviews, of the interviewed, of the people who are interviewed, of the interviewees are not disturbed. Locating an informant. Now the researcher must find an insider who is a member of the group that is studied, who is willing to be an informant and act as a guide and translator of cultural mores and at times jargon or language. Many times we may go into a situation that we do not understand, so it's always helpful to find an informant, a go-between, a liaison between us, between the interviewer and the interviewee, who can help us understand what the interviewee is getting at when we ask them questions, who can help us decipher the responses to the questions we are asking. Then gaining the trust of the respondents becomes a very, very important concern of the interviewer. Establishing a good rapport with the respondents is absolutely critical to this process, where one goes in and one tries to understand, we start a conversation, and within that conversation we try and understand what the interviewee is giving us. So we pick out the relevant pieces of information from a regular or as close to a regular conversation as possible. Types of unstructured interviewing, we have various ways in which unstructured interviewing goes. One could be an oral history, where it's most often dependent on memory and the ability to recall, which in turn are often influenced by the social processes they relate to. So we ask people, what happened to you? What did you go through? What did you deal with? And the person talks about their own selves, and we say, this is what I had, this is what I did. So again, I'll take the example that I dealt with last time. There was an earthquake in Indonesia recently. So if we were to ask people about the trauma they experienced, we'll say, okay, what did you go through? How did you deal with it? What was happening to you when the earth shook so violently? And they say, okay, I was standing there and I saw the tree fall, I saw the building fall, I saw the car being thrown up, or maybe there's been a cyclone in Chennai recently. And so all of these things are oral histories, personal experiences of people narrated in the form of stories, complete with their emotions and biases and selective picking of information. So that is one type of an unstructured interview that we could conduct. We ask people about what they went through. The other type here, of course, is creative interviewing. So the researcher keeps the final goal in mind and structures the interviews and questions according to the changing patterns of interaction among the interviewer and the interviewee. So we start a rapport, we start a conversation, and we ask them questions, and the questions keep leading us to more and more information. So we keep the final goal in mind, we keep the focus, but we let the conversation flow in as natural a manner as possible. And this is the most common type of unstructured interview that is conducted to collect information, especially in exploratory research, where we do not know what we are getting at. We do not know what we are in for. We don't know what is out there. So in order to get this, we keep our eyes and ears open. We try and get as much information from the situation as possible without disturbing the status quo. That is absolutely critical. The primary purpose of an unstructured interview is to maintain the status quo as far as possible, is to ensure that the comfort zones of the respondents are not disturbed as far as possible, and conversation flows and the comfort levels of the respondents are maintained, and a rapport is built between the interviewer and the interviewee, and in and through conversation we get the information we want from them without making them even more vulnerable or without disturbing them at all. So that is one more way of interviewing. Now the gendered interviews are another types of interviews in which the gender or the sex of the interviewer influences the interview situation. There are it will influence the kinds of situations that a person has access to. We discussed the case of a lady female interviewer going into a school or a preschool to see how children behave in normal situations. How do, let's say we want to study the patterns of friendships in preschool. How do children make friends in preschool? They've just come out of their homes, they've just started going to a social situation on a regular basis. How do they interact? How do they connect with other people? So something very, very interesting, something of something that helps us understand how the child will socialize in later life. Now women are likely to have a more access to such situations, and the gender of the person, male or female, will affect how children respond to the presence of a person sitting there and talking to their parents, or the gender of the person will also affect how parents respond to the person sitting in front of them. The personal characteristics, the gender will affect what people have access to, the kinds of interpretation the data may undergo, because the mother in most cases is the primary caregiver. So people may feel more comfortable talking to women in such situations. So the gender does influence the way the interview shapes up, the attitude of respondents to the interview situation, and the interviewer, again, what they've been able to relate to, what they've not been able to relate to. So you go to a situation in which there is civil strife, there are lots of armed forces personnel, and they are expecting to see a rugged man in that situation, or a male dominated profession, maybe even in the manufacturing sector, in the factory, in on the shop floor. If they go and they see a woman coming to interview them, and they say, what is she going to do with it? Try as hard as we might, these are roles that are played by specific genders even till now. So it may become difficult for the respondents to relate to the person who is interviewing them, and their responses are likely to change. Okay, so in such situations, since we know that something like this is going to happen, we pick the person with the right gender to go into that situation and interview people. So if we know that, say, a female interviewer will be more accepted in a preschool, then if we have that flexibility, we will find a female interviewer to go into that situation, because the nature of the responses is going to be much richer, because the respondents will feel much more comfortable in the presence of a woman. And please, all due respect to our male researchers who are studying child development, nothing against you, but this is something that is very commonly known. If you've experienced, you must have experienced this if you've really gone out into the field, that it becomes easier for children and their parents to relate to a woman interviewer sitting in a preschool and talking to you for whatever reason. Okay, then framing and interpreting unstructured interviews. An unstructured interview is an informal conversation that should be carried out keeping the final goal in mind. We need to use appropriate language and words. The non-verbal techniques that we use are absolutely critical. Your eye contact, what you wear, how you conduct yourself, the physical distance between you and the interviewer, where do you sit and talk. I mean, both of you need to be comfortable. So all of those things, your eye contact with the interviewer, the facial expressions you have when you are talking to an interviewer. The interviewer maybe is telling you a traumatic story and you have a smirk in your face. Yeah, right. That can very, very badly affect the kind of response you will get from the interviewer, because the interviewee, because the interviewee is observing everything that the interviewer is doing when they are asking them personal questions. Consciously or subconsciously, they are able to see what or how the information they are giving to the interviewer is being processed. And so if they are telling us about a traumatic event in their lives, we need to be empathetic to them. They say something happened to me, and you say, oh really, and you have to be genuinely interested. Unless the interviewer is in the moment and is genuinely trying to understand empathetically what happened at that point, it is going to become very difficult for the interviewee to give them the right kind of information. Okay. The age of respondents is also critical here. The age of respondents will affect how the the interview shapes up. So the kinds of questions we ask needs to be according to the age of the respondents. The kinds of responses we expect will depend on the vocabulary of the respondents, of what they've been exposed to. So we can't ask children very complicated questions. We need to be at the same or as close to the mental, social, contextual level of the respondents as possible, so that they open up. The critical part here is that the respondents need to open up to the interviewer. Okay, the effect of the interviewer's own age on the respondents. that is also going to affect how respondents respond to you. So the kind of role they see you in as, and that will affect how the questions are framed. The next type of interview that we will discuss here is group interviewing. It's also known as focused group interviews. So group interviewing happens when interviewer or moderator directs the inquiry and interaction among respondents in a very structured fashion. So we get a group of people together, we select the people who we want to talk about, or who we want to talk to together, and we get them together and we start a conversation, and we direct the conversation in a very structured manner. So we ask a question, people discuss it amongst themselves, we record the responses, and then we go through the conversation that has taken place and make our notes alongside and even afterwards, after going through what has been recorded. So usually these days, with all the techniques with the technology available, we use a video camera, maybe if possible, and if the respondents agree, it will help to use a video camera to record the entire interview and then pick relevant pieces of information. Then it is exploratory, and it may be used to test a methodological technique or try out a definition of a research problem or to identify key informants. So it's just a tool to get more into the research. It may be used for triangulation and other data gathering techniques. It may be used to supplement what we have understood from another data gathering technique, to validate the findings from another technique. It must be used in conjunction with other techniques. It cannot be used on its own. Group interviewing cannot stand, in most cases it is not used on its own. It cannot form the only way of gathering data. It should be supplemented with other techniques to make sure that the data is analyzed properly and the findings are robust and acceptable to the research community. The skills of group interviewers are flexibility, objectivity, empathy. Flexibility in terms of maintaining a focus and still letting the conversation flow. Objectivity is when you take yourself out of the interview situation, you're directing the conversation, but you're also able to see the conversation from the perspective of somebody who's not involved in the situation. Empathy, the ability to relate to the respondents, the ability to persuade the respondents, the ability to listen is also very critical here. Some concerns regarding group interviews: when people are talking in a group, there could be one individual or a subgroup could dominate the entire conversation or discussion. The quiet participants who don't feel comfortable participating could also become a concern for the interviewer. There could be some people who just don't feel comfortable talking. They're part of this group, but then when people start talking about different things, there could be some people who are very quiet, who just don't participate. So it becomes very important for the interviewer to obtain responses from all members of the group to ensure coverage of the entire group. And so in some way, very subtly, very tactfully, the interviewer can direct the questions to the people who are not participating. Then balancing the moderators and interviewers' role. So the interviewer should, on the one hand, the interviewer needs to ask questions, get the information, and also make sure that the discussion stays on track. So and also make sure that the participants are participating properly, or they are participating to the best of their ability. So the quiet ones don't stay quiet too much, the talkers don't talk so much. So that balancing act all constitutes the moderator's role. Then balancing between the script of the questions and evaluation of issues within the group, and focus on the original problem. After all, we are trying to get an answer to a problem we have, and the focus needs to be there. We also need to make sure that we stick to the script of the the questionnaire, the guidelines or the direction that we have taken through our interview schedule needs to be maintained, and also an opportunity needs to be given to the conversation to flow as unhindered as possible. So these are a few concerns regarding group interviews. Now, some advantages of group interviews: they are less expensive. We don't need to make arrangements for getting in individual people. They yield richer data because a lot of people are constructing information. They are arriving, responses from other respondents who have gone through the same situation will stimulate the responses from the people who are not talking so much. So somebody says something that strikes your memory, and so that sparks off your memory, and that in turn leads to you giving some information that you may not have thought of if you were the only one. Or now I'm talking from the perspective of the respondent. If somebody says something that triggers your memory and you come out with something that you may not have thought of earlier if you were the only one being interviewed, so it yields richer data. It may prove to be stimulating for respondents and may also help respondents recall significant details regarding the problem to be discussed. Again, somebody says something that stimulates your memory, that jogs your memory, that motivates you to speak up, and the format is very flexible, so that's very helpful here. Okay, some problems the group interviewer could face: the results cannot be generalized because every group interview is different. There could be dominance within the group, and that may suppress individual expression. Single group dynamics are more complex. A more skillful person is needed as an interviewer or moderator, so the dynamics within the group could be a problem. It will be very difficult to research sensitive topics in a group interview. People are feeling vulnerable, they've gone through situations, they just don't want to open up in front of other people. So when we're talking about very traumatic experiences where people have felt very vulnerable, they feel they could lose face, they could lose their public image by saying that they made a mistake. That kind of interview could be very difficult, so we can't broach sensitive topics. Or maybe some trauma. Sometimes talking about trauma helps, sometimes talking about trauma disturbs the comfort zone of the interviewed, so that could be a problem. So that may not be a very good setting to get the information regarding vulnerable, regarding sensitive topics out of people. So okay, now the last part of this presentation deals with interviewing and technology, and I've put dots here. Now various ways in which we can conduct interviews these days are: one is of course face to face, which is the most obvious one. Then we also use technology for interviewing. We could conduct interviews on telephones, we could conduct interviews over Skype, over voice over IP, over all kinds of technologies that are available these days, and that's why these dots are there, that you can be as creative, you can find out or you can add to this list as much as possible. So technology is being used extensively these days to conduct interviews and to get the information from other people. So interviews specifically deal with getting information from our respondents who in social situations, and this is a very, very useful technique, very useful method of gathering data in the even in quantitative research methods, but especially in qualitative research methods. Unstructured interviews are extremely useful because they help us find out what is out there without really making preconceived or having preconceived notions about what we could hope to find. So that's a very, very useful tool. This is all we have time for in this class, and we will continue with some more strategies of gathering data, some more methods of gathering data and analyzing them in the upcoming classes. So thank you very much for listening.